Welcome everybody to the last session of the Scientists Warning Europe Planet in Crisis pre-COP event on our Nature Day. As you'll know from the Scientists Warnings, nature is a hugely important part of it, amongst other factors. And in 1992, 1,700 scientists wrote their first warning to humanity. In 2017, the World Scientists Warning to Humanity, a second notice, was endorsed by 20,000 scientists. And then in 2019, on the 5th of November last year, on the same day as President Trump tried to take America out of the Paris Accord, has succeeded, but we hope they go back in, the world scientists issued their warning of a climate emergency. And I'm delighted to say that one of our panelists here, Professor Phoebe Barnard, was one of the co-authors of that warning. As we've done on the other sessions today, as we start and paying honour to the World Scientists Warning of a climate emergency, we read out the passage on nature to put ourselves into the context. So this is it. We must protect and restore Earth's ecosystems: phytoplankton, coral reefs, forests, savannas, grasslands, wetlands, peatlands, soils, mangroves and seagrasses contribute greatly to sequestration of atmospheric CO2. Marine and terrestrial plants, animals and microorganisms play significant roles in carbon and nutrient cycling and storage. We need to quickly curtail habitat and biodiversity loss, protecting the remaining primary and intact forests, especially those with high carbon stores and other forests with the capacity to rapidly sequester carbon, pro-forestation, while increasing reforestation and afforestation where appropriate at enormous scales. Although available land may be limited in places, up to a third of emissions reductions needed by 2030 for the Paris Agreement, reaching less than 2 degrees C, could be obtained with these natural climate solutions. So that's the context with which we meet today. We're following on from 3 fantastic talks. And before we move on, there are another 4 sessions tomorrow. And we'll be finishing with a session tomorrow in which the key speaker is Professor Bill Newman, who'll be talking specifically about the World Scientist Warning to Humanity and was one of the co-authors with Professor Phoebe Barnard. Our expert panel here includes Professor Phoebe Barnard, and Phoebe is actually a board member of Scientists Warning Europe, for which we are eternally thankful. Thank you, Phoebe. Phoebe is a biodiversity conservation biologist, working on climate risk and resilience, global change, and an ecologist, environmental futures analyst and sustainability strategist, chief scientific and policy officer with the Conservation Biology Institute and affiliate full professor at the University of Washington. Phoebe says that she's fueled by her core authorship of the World Scientist Warning of a Climate Emergency and her work to implement its 6 recommendations. We're joined by Professor Chris Rapley. Chris has agreed to join our scientific advisory panel for Scientists Warning Europe. Again, thank you, Chris, for agreeing to that. Chris is Professor of Climate Science at University College London, member of the advisory board of the UK Government's Clean Growth Fund, a member of the UK Science Museum Group's Science Advisory Board, and a member of the UK Parliamentary and Scientific Committee. He's chair of the UCL Policy Commission on Communicating Climate Science. More recently, Chris has been involved as the science consultant on BBC One's Climate Change, The Facts, presented by Sir David Attenborough. In 2003, Chris was appointed CBE by Her Majesty the Queen. We're also very grateful to Dr. Mau Amos joining us from South Africa. Dr. Amos is the founder and executive director of the African Centre for a Green Economy, an adjunct associate professor at the Graduate School of Business, University of Cape Town. The African Centre for a Green Economy is a non-profit think tank and capacity building organisation based in South Africa. Dr. Amos has extensive experience in green growth and well-being issues in Africa and regularly consults on the same for development agencies, government, and the private sector across Africa and globally. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'll now hand over to the panel for your opening addresses. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Ed. Would you like me to go first then? I'm delighted to see everyone here And please tell me if there's a difficult connection line, because I know there's been a little bit during this session. It's wonderful to see colleagues and especially some friends, Ignas, Beth, Alan, Fola, Jeffrey, Islamia. Wonderful to see you all. And what a week, what a year, what a month. This is really a time for crossroads of humanity. We all understand that. I think we're starting to see that humanity as a whole in many countries starting to really understand that and feel it. How are we going to take the recommendations from our scientist warning paper in these 6 areas and implement them most effectively? So I just like to share for a second, if I may, the grounding issues of the scientist warning paper, which posed strict recommendations for energy conservation and efficiency, food systems reform and regenerative agriculture, nature and land, which is our subject today, nature and how to help mobilize natural climate solutions, reduction of atmospheric pollutants, population stabilization, and a shift of economic goals away from profit and GDP and towards human well-being. And as all of you will see, this range of 6 areas is so interconnected that we can't really talk about one without the other. For example, land conservation and regenerative agriculture without short-term atmospheric pollutants, including methane, for example. So I'm speaking to you from Washington State in the USA, although I have been living in Southern Africa most of my life, and it will be a pleasure to talk with you about biodiversity, climate risk and resilience, conservation, restoration, and how we can all be involved in making transformative change happen in society. Hey, there's my sister as well. Hello, Sue and Jeff. Welcome, everyone. Chris, would you like to go next?
Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I just, as a climate scientist, I just thought I'd very quickly paint in the background of what science has told us. And as originally trained as a physicist, what interests me is that by adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, increasing the load of greenhouse gases, we've upset the energy balance of the planet. And it's as if every single person on the planet, all 7.8 billion of us, each had a 23 kilowatt kettles, which we were running continuously, pouring hot water into the ocean. And that's where most of that energy goes. About 94% of it goes into the ocean, 2% into the atmosphere, 2% into the ice, and 2% into the land. And we don't live in the ocean, so we're not necessarily so aware of that accumulation of energy, which is going on as we speak. But there are consequences of that energy imbalance in the climate system, leading to warming. We've seen a degree of warming already since pre-industrial. Seen increased heat waves. We see wildfires. We see floods. We see intensified storms. We see greater instability of the system and greater extremes. And this affects ecosystems. It affects agriculture, and through those means and the direct damages to infrastructure, it affects human affairs, increasing instability, migration in particular. So we have a climate crisis. Science has told us that it's real, it's us, it's significant, and we know that if we don't get a grip on it, we can push the system through some thresholds where we begin to lose control. So the level of priority and urgency with which it's being addressed at present fall far short of what's needed. Now, the good news is that of the carbon dioxide that we have pumped into the atmosphere, mainly through fossil fuel use, about half of it has been left in the atmosphere and is causing all of these consequences. But a quarter of it was taken up by the ocean, sadly causing the ocean to become more acidic, but nevertheless that compensated and ameliorated the climate effects. And the other quarter that we emitted went into the land biosphere. So the idea of helping the planet heal itself through rewilding, through changing agricultural practices so that we increase the amount of carbon held in soils and so on, is a major plank, or has to be a major plank in our approach to addressing the climate crisis, getting our net emissions down to zero by the middle of the century, which is what we have to do if we're to meet the Paris agreement of not letting warming exceed 2 degrees and keeping it as close as 1.5 degrees as possible. So my interest as a scientist is, well, how do we do that? Scientists confronted with an audience as academics tend instinctively to ask themselves, so what do these people need to know? And so we deliver facts and information and insights in what's called the information deficit mode, in the hope that somehow those facts will be computed inside people's heads, they will see the light, and they will take action to help us achieve these carbon reduction goals. But all of the psychology says that that isn't really the way humans work at all. And instead we have to ask ourselves, not what do these people need to know, but what do we want to work with people to help them do? And in this particular case, helping the planet heal itself is an objective. And to do that, we need to sit down using a different set of skills and a different set of approaches to work with people in a co-productive way to help all elements of society find their agency, their ability to act, their particular way of contributing to that goal of net zero emissions by 2050. And I'm happy to expand on that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Mao, would you like to say something?
Yes, thanks, Phoebe and everyone for joining us in this talk. I see former colleague Stephen Aoyemi is on the line. We're welcome. Really, I would like to, my name obviously is Mao Amis. My background is in conservation biology, and what has really inspired me has always been the closeness to nature, coming up from a very rural landscape, and directly interacting with nature and so on. But over the years, we have seen how much the climate is changing, the temperature increase, and really weather pattern changes on the ground that has made life very, very difficult. So for me, that's really what inspires me. And for the work that I do at the African Center for Green Economy is to find out what are those solutions on the ground that we can really implement to enable us to be able to, first of all, reduce ecosystem degradation, but also to create a better life for people. There's millions of Africans that are actually in extreme poverty, and we cannot talk about nature without talking about the kind of solutions that are going to inspire them. But for me, for this session, my worry is that we're losing the battle. If you look at what the UN says about how much in terms of financing is required to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, we are short of $2.5 trillion per annum. That is what is required. And SDG 15 and 14, which talks about, about land, about biodiversity under the sea, is one of the most impacted in terms of shortage of financing to enable us to do the kind of work that is required on the ground. So the challenge is enormous. We really have to find ways of how to make sure that we can be able to curtail ecosystem degradation on the one hand, but also to be able to mobilize the required financing, whether it's crowding in private sector, because at the moment, all the funding that is coming to do some of this work is actually just coming from the public sector. We have not been able to mobilize the required amount of funding. So what are the kind of business models that would allow us to be able to be much more innovative, to be able to push the needle in terms of curtailing this environmental degradation that we're faced with? Unfortunately, for us as environmentalists, as ecologists, we tend to work in silos. But my experience on the ground working with at the landscape level is that the challenge is multidimensional. We need to work with public sector officials, we need to work with business people, we need to work with community organizers and so on. That is the only way we're able to win this war. And that means that we need to be able to, first of all, understand that the landscapes that require restoration are complex socio-ecological systems. And we need to understand what are the kind of models, what are the kind of approaches, what are the kind of tools that we require at the landscape level to be able to undertake this restoration that is happening. We can protect our forests, we can protect our wetlands, but with significant population pressure in these critical ecosystems, we will not be able to achieve the kind of outcomes that we desire. So, and maybe I'll talk about that later, but we think that as ecologists, as a community, we need to think about scale. If we were to be able to restore some of the most important landscapes globally, how can we be able to achieve that? What is the kind of partnership that's required at the landscape level? What is the kind of financing mechanisms that we need to implement? What are the kind of technologies that we need to adopt to be able to allow us to be able to move the needle? And until we answer some of these questions, I'm afraid, we will be beating around the bush.
Great. Thank you very much, Mao. We've just started getting some questions in, but I would like to urge you all on now, crowd. We've got an absolutely packed event and we've had one question. So come on, you've got some of the world's absolute top experts here. Let's get some more questions in so that we can start asking them. That also makes my job easier because I don't have to try and invent some questions to ask as well. So could you please start popping some questions into the chat? First question, I'm absolutely delighted to see, actually. It's one that I probably would have been asking as well. So it comes from Kevin Webb. I have many friends worldwide, and at least half of my American friends do not believe climate change is real, so no need to change their behavior. How do we convince these people? They deny the science. If I could just add an extra comment onto that in a more general sense, and although I don't believe in Britain there are so many denying the science, it would seem that they just don't get it, in inverted commas, like a sort of teenager would say, do you get it? So I'd like to ask, how do we get people to get it? And we could probably base our answer in two areas, individual and then decision makers. Could I ask Chris maybe to answer first, partly because I know this is an area you're very interested in, Chris.
Yes, thank you. Happy to take this. Sorry, my phone will stop. Yes, indeed. Well, there's a range, there's a spectrum of people in the lay public, not experts on climate change. And there's, if we set the USA aside, there's been a significant reduction of the number of people who deny climate change. And so certainly in the UK now, the number of people who dismiss climate change or deny that we should do anything about it is a relatively small rump, although often powerful and in powerful places, so they do have to be dealt with. The problem with people who have come to the conclusion that they disbelieve or instinctively feel that they disbelieve the evidence that climate change is real, driven by us and needs to be dealt with, is that it's become a sort of badge of identity or an expression of identity, and it's often wrapped up with other particular political views, often what you might call generally right-wing views. And it's like a religious belief. You're not going to persuade people who hold those views by offering them facts and evidence. It's interesting, there's a lot of research that shows that the more scientifically educated they are, the more clever they are, the more able they are to find arguments that satisfy their own conviction that they are right, and also to persuade others. We all tend to work and live and associate with people who it's more comfortable to do so, to associate with people who have similar views. And so they form a bubble where they reinforce that conviction. So there's a lot of evidence that there's no point in what you might call a direct frontal assault by showing them graphs of CO2, curves and so on. That makes things worse. It causes people to retrench. So with the people who aren't quite so retrenched, that's a different issue, and I'll come back to that. But dealing with people who are utterly retrenched, and we all, have a grouchy uncle or whoever it is who's in that mode. What one has to do is find some area of common purpose. So most people don't want to make the future worse, and so one can find that agreement. A lot of people on the right are concerned about what they see as unnecessary government interference. They're concerned about waste of money. They're concerned about defending their livelihoods. So what one has to do, particularly if you're in a rural community, is say, how easy is it to grow your crops these days, let's say? And they'll immediately say, oh, things have got so much worse since I was a boy or whatever. The floods are worse, the fires are worse, the droughts are worse, or whatever it is. So one then has got a point where one can engage, and it's finding that point of engagement and then working through, never talking about climate change, but saying, well, what actions might we take to make you more resilient to this? And indeed, are the things that we could do that would make it less likely to happen? So it's finding some area of common ground. What's more difficult, actually, is not really the climate dismissers, but it's those that kind of accept the premise that there's a problem, but really aren't doing very much and are in a state of what we call disavowal. And in a way, the climate science community is in many ways the most practiced at this. And disavowal is a psychological state where you take a very discomforting and stressful piece of knowledge and you put it away in part of your head where you accept it, but you kind of dodge around it. And I give an example of climate scientists who, let's say, model the climate. I've worked with those groups, and there's a tendency to see the planet as the object of study. And when you pack up and leave the office or the lab at the end of the evening and drive to Tesco's to buy your food, it's as if you're in a different world. So it's making that connection between what we know and what we need to do, which is the tricky thing. And so working with people to, first of all, overcome that psychological discomfort, and then find ways that elevate them and inspire them to work to do something to make the situation better, that is really the more important issue, because that's the way we're going to solve the problem.
Great, thank you, Chris. Phoebe, could I hand it over to you for a comment on that? And then I'm going to add in something else before I bring it back to Mao, but on the same topic. Go ahead.
I think we all agree that the scientific community has been hopeless at dealing with these communication and engagement issues for a long time, up until quite recently, and to some extent even now. Partly because we've been trained to deliver facts, and we've been trained to speak in the driest, most dusty, most alienating way possible, and it's horrific. I'm sorry, I'm really I get agitated about that quite easily, but as a species we've evolved with storytelling, and it's storytelling and it's values and love that motivate most people. And so if you look at the matrix of motivators about climate change, most ordinary people are motivated by love for nature or for childhood memories, or the land that they farm, or whatever it might be. And yes, policymakers are sometimes motivated by need, but hardly anybody is motivated by loss or facts, and our brains don't process them too well. So for a long time, I've realized that there's a power in film, in engaging and transforming people. There's a power in future scenarios to help people look at alternative, plausible futures that evolve or arise out of our current choices. And I particularly work on those two things now, especially after hours, because they need to supplement what we do. But also, I think Chris referred to matters of faith, and I think most of us have heard of that wonderful climate scientist and born-again Baptist, Catherine Hayhoe, who has really made big inroads with right-wing communities in the US Bible Belt, helping engage them in a way that they can understand. So we need to be much more creative, because we all need to really feel in our guts the need for big, powerful, transformative change. And that does help lift people out of the ideological political arguments.
Ed, would you mind if I just added to that a little comment? Is that okay? I don't want to hog it. Yes, if I could say that the academics and climate scientists in particular are used to delivering their information in a very formal way, the way that they do in a university when they're teaching students and indeed talking to their peers. But there's another mode that one can adopt, which we call the informed citizen mode. That is where you essentially take off your white coat or your gown and you invite people to have a fireside chat where you free yourself, you liberate yourself from the constraints of a formal scientific presentation, which requires you to put in all the bells and whistles about the uncertainties and so on, and simply as a human being explain what this means to you, why it means what it does to you, and what you feel emotionally needs to be done, morally, ethically, what the consequences are for your family and your children. And people appreciate that fireside chat. They accept the fact that they're not getting all of the detail, but they don't really need the detail. We don't need to make lots of little mini climate scientists. We want to get people to accept that there's a problem, believe that there's a reliable set of evidence that says that there's a problem, and then have an adult conversation about what we can do about it. So that's a lot of scientists are beginning to realize that and move into that mode of operating now, and it's very helpful.
Thank you, Chris. Mao, just before I bring you in, can I read out another comment, which is slightly related? It's not related to South Africa, but we will relate it. It's actually one that was directed at Chris from Belinda. The trouble is a lot of people in power pay lip service by, for example, declaring a climate emergency. But if my fellow town councillors are anything to go by, they don't really get it. We need the public to demand action at every political level. We'd be interested, Mao, on your general comments, like with the others, in terms of scientists communicating, but also maybe moving on to politicians at both levels, both middle and higher levels in South Africa or Africa. Are they getting the climate science, and is that driving them? Do they get it in their bellies, and that does that make them take action?
Well, I mean, I can say two things. One is that as scientists, we are bad communicators. You know, I always say that, you know, I'm a recovering academic, you know, because the language that we need to speak to our constituencies, to the mobilizers on the ground, is completely removed from the thought leadership that happens in academia. And so we need to redeem ourselves, first of all, by being able to understand what are the kind of entry points that we can engage with our constituencies, whether it's, you know, the public sector officials, community organizers, and so on. I think we've been very bad at that. You know, while I was thinking about this talk, I was actually thinking that maybe what we need is we just need a Kim Kardashian to start, you know, sending Instagram stories about land degradation. Probably will have much more impact than, you know, a paper that is published in Nature. But I think that with the politicians, I mean, I think the story is almost global, that these issues are starting to gain traction, but it's taking much, much longer, what I'm seeing on our side. But, you know, in Southern Africa, we've had significant issues around extreme events, like, you know, flooding, extended drought, and so on. So those provide leverage to engage with public sector officials. But it's very difficult to go and talk to politicians who are campaigning for an election that is happening in the next, you know, 6 months about protecting a specific wetland if it does not have a direct implication on their constituency. So I think that we need to watch where are the opportunities to engage public sector officials and capitalize on those opportunities. I reckon previously there was Professor Lorenzo, who wrote a book around well-being economy, and he's actually ex-minister in Italy. We've done work before with him. He says what we need to do as environmentalists is maybe actually go to public office. You know, let's wear a politician's hat and go and engage on the other side. I think we're too divided. We're seeing this as, you know, if you like, bilateral, how do you say, bilateral, or, you know, we're so divided. We need to be able to adopt the language of the public sector officials and basically influence policies from the other side as well.
Thank you. And in fact, that last note certainly is fantastic. We should get everybody here should be thinking about standing for office at whatever level in their own country, be it at the lowest parish council level, at the county or state, or to run for office at the highest level. Because even if you don't get in, you get the opportunity to communicate the issue and to change opinions. So important. Absolutely. We've got to go to a very different topic now, but quite related if we're talking about nature. Josephine Parish asks, is ecotourism a business model?
Oh.
Throw this to Phoebe first. Sorry, Phoebe, I should have just asked first.
No, I've been worried about ecotourism for a long time while I was living in Africa. And I think this year has shown how vulnerable the tourism industry can be insofar as it's an international market. I think it's definitely important domestically where people don't have to fly. And it is adapting to a large extent to the pandemic. But it's one of many shocks to the system that we've seen this year that completely jeopardizes the livelihoods of many, many people, not only where I've been living in Namibia and South Africa, Uganda, and Tanzania, but across developing countries. And so I would be wary of making it a big underpinning of national economies the way it has been for Kenya, Namibia, and Botswana, and many other countries.
Thank you very much. I can't see Mao now currently on the screen. Has he disappeared? Oh, you're there, Mao. So thank you very much. If you would mind commenting on the same thing, please.
Look, my approach is that, you know, there's no one shoe that fits all. There are situations where ecotourism becomes a mechanism for leveraging, you know, actual conservation work. If you look at communities that are dependent on, you know, that are around nature conservation, protected areas, for example, they need, you know, economic activity to happen, and tourism does provide an incentive to be able to catalyze change on the ground, but it's not to be seen as the one shoe that fits all. We then lend ourselves to greenwashing. The idea that there's only 2, 3, 4 mechanisms that can allow us get out of this crisis, for me, that's not really the way to go.
Thank you very much. I think, Chris, rather than coming to you on this, we'll move on to another question. So from Will Saunders, how do we make a circular economy, or one of not eternal growth, appealing to those who are in control, especially business leaders who have a vested financial interest in not understanding? And I'll just add in from Rosalind Kent, who asked, how do we incentivize the public?
Mao can probably give a much better discussion of this, but let me start with saying I think partly it's something where political leadership by those who do get it will start to shift the wave, start to tip that wave. And I see it here in Washington State, where we've got some wonderful ecosystem and climate leadership at the city and county and state level. And so it can happen, but where it's not receiving any kind of traction yet, it's a bigger challenge. Mao, maybe you can add comment.
Yeah, thanks. I think that, you know, the circular economies gain quite a bit of traction. And I say that because my center is called the African Center for Green Economy. The stereotype we have had for a long time is greenies are these environmentalists, these tree huggers who are just concerned about the environment. For once, the circular economy is starting to nudge other players on the table. And I think that we are likely to make much more progress in terms of bringing particularly the private sector players onto the table around the issue around circular economy, because the circular economy essentially says, how can you tweak your business model in a way that you can build resilience in the face of these climate risks without necessarily, you know, either losing your business and so on. But it really, I think there's an opportunity with the circular economy in trying to lead the conversations in a way that could allow us to achieve the systemic change we require. My worry with the way the issues around circular economy have been framed is that it tends to be more about waste management, for example. It's not really very systemic around the kind of changes that we require. So we have to be very careful, again, in terms of that we don't box ourselves into a corner. Because if you look at all the literature around circular economy, it's really just about product development and so on. But some of the challenges that we face are beyond, you know, a particular product. It's around a system. How do we bring about that system-wide change? And I think that the conversation there hasn't advanced that much.
Ed, can I add just briefly to that? Because I know that people like Kevin Webb, who's sitting there in Thailand in the middle of the night, thank you, Kevin, for joining us even, and has been asking about capitalism and the nature of the economy. Getting policymakers to understand it when they haven't yet is partly an issue of appealing to values and using the right kind of language. Most of us have grown up with families that at least appreciate the notion of efficiency, or at least dislike the notion of wastefulness. And what is the linear economy but wasteful and inefficient? And so I think that there's a level at which we can engage with people there. Those of you who have watched Annie Leonard's wonderful series, The Story of Stuff, and all the other cartoon films that she has produced, will also have been able, I hope, to show that to friends and family and maybe even their local mayors to help with that. But essentially, a lot of these things are at a national and global level that we need to make changes. And they're tipping points. And I would love to be able to think that because there is there's very little time left to make these changes, that we would be able to just flip a switch and either reform capitalism so fundamentally that it can become a circular kind of capitalism, or that we can shift peacefully and smoothly and without any violence or misery to a social democracy and a more fundamentally equitable and just and sustainable economy. But we need to really pull out our finger on this, because I think those of us who have been working on biodiversity and climate change all of our lives feel that without fundamental economic goal shifts away from profit, away from GDP, we are all just screaming into the wind, to put it as delicately as I can.
Okay, before I throw it over to you, Chris, could I just interject there? Maybe it's also about looking at how we define profit as not simply financial. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, well, this is an area that I only look into obliquely, but I do brief, businesses a great deal. And one of the great untold stories is the huge amount of work that's going on in business to do more than just make profit. And I think that we should recognise the importance of pioneers, champions, first movers. And there's a particular company that asked me some years ago to go and talk to them about climate change, a company in the west of England who provide essentially printheads and Xerox paper, business services, materials to a wide range of small businesses in the area. It's a private company. The lady who leads it went to an Al Gore Inconvenient Truth event, and that was her moment of truth. It was an epiphany. She went back and said, I'm going to make my company, or our company, the most efficient in terms of not only making profit but also reducing its impact, environmental impact on the planet. Her finance director started fighting her tooth and nail, saying, you're going to wreck the company, we're going to go under. And after a few years, he was the champion. He was saying, I could not have believed, first of all, the impact on the bottom line of the efficiency savings that we've been making. But he said, our staff turnover is zero, our staff morale is through the roof, our staff productivity is through the roof. People come here because they feel this company has an ethical and moral mission which uplifts them. They come with a spring in their step. They're proud to be members of it. And that message has radiated out to her supply chains and to her customers, and she has been changing the way a whole raft of businesses in that region operate. So it's a really good news story, and it's the sort of story that doesn't make it above the waterline into the media very much, but I can give many other examples. So it's not quite the circular economy, but what is the economy but the emergent behavior of a whole load of individual granular pieces. And so where the granular pieces are on the move, that can have an impact on the emergent behavior.
Great, thank you. I think we'll move to a slightly different area. So we've got a question here from Brandon Abdinor. Financiers and investors are used to and expect to lend money for projects with high returns in a money sense, How do they get persuaded to invest in greening interventions that don't obviously or traditionally provide these types of returns? Before I set you off on that, I'd like to read one more from Crispine Bota. In Malawi, we're implementing a USAID-funded project that's using conservation enterprise approach, among other approaches, to bring in the private sector to contribute to biodiversity conservation through innovative business models. We're yet to see how financiers would respond to these models, whose returns aren't as attractive as the conventional ones. Any lessons from other countries? So who would like to take this one first? Not a volunteer, somebody. Mao, would you like to start on this one?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that, because at the moment we're doing a project in 6 Southern Africa countries trying to around climate finance. And one of the things we're doing is engaging with development finance institutions and so on. And what we're finding is that there's a bias towards mitigation type projects. And that's because they're easily packaged in a way that, the return on profit can easily be quantified, and therefore they're able to invest in it. But from an adaptation perspective, it's very difficult. Obviously, there's issues around timelines that, typical adaptation type projects, take much longer time, and the returns are not obvious. And I think that one of the ways to be able to take inroads, particularly with development finance institution, is the idea of a risk-based approach. Because if you look at a landscape, there are various companies that are located within a particular landscape. And each of those are exposed to different types of risks. If it's a brewing company, for example, SAB Miller, that's a big company here, they found that water is one of their most significant risks that they face. And so when you take that type of approach, you're able to engage with the private sector somewhat. But it's still an area that is emerging. No one has really been able to put, a handle on how we can be able to package, particularly adaptation type projects, in a way that can speak to the private sector, even though there are guarantee mechanisms. So the idea of blended finance does help in mitigating some of the potential risk exposure that private sector are very wary about in terms of investing in some of these projects.
Yeah.
Phoebe. Oh, sorry, Chris, you're going to go ahead. That's fine.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Mark Carney, when he was still, Bank of England head in the UK, gave a speech about 4 years ago called "The Tragedy of the Horizon," where he bemoaned short-termism in the world of finance and the world of business. And I think Al Gore gives an example where he polled a number of senior business people or middle-ranking business people in the US and said, if you have a decision to make tomorrow that will give you a better return in 3 months than in 2 years, but if the long-term benefit of the company is better doing the 2-year decision, which one will you go for? And he had 100% response saying, well, we'll go for the 3-month one because that's what drives our bonuses. So there is incipient and inherent short-termism at all levels in the business cycle of the economy. But what Nick Stern showed is that if you don't use a discount rate that makes the future less costly, if you look at real damages in the future and cost them as if they were happening to you rather than your grandchildren, then the economics say that it's much better to invest to prevent the future from being as bad as it might be than wait to clear things up afterwards. And so that's been the big troublesome spot. Interestingly, the world has shifted very significantly over the last 2 or 3 years. And I'll give an example. 10 years ago, I was asked to give a talk on climate change to the pension fund investors in the city in the UK. And I was received with utterly blank stares. They had absolutely no idea why this academic was telling them about climate change. Now I quite regularly get unsolicited calls from major investors saying, hey, we know we've got carbon bubbles, we know we've got stranded assets, we're really frightened that we're failing in our fiducial duty to manage our risks, and we don't know who to talk to help us deal with this. And the reason for this is that the planet has accelerated faster than the climate community imagined. We all thought that this was going to be a problem for our children and grandchildren, but it's actually a problem for us. The Californian wildfires are a hugely serious financial and social impact on California. People are migrating from California because they can no longer insure their homes or their businesses. So this is a situation which is now. So actually the horizon has come towards us, and this is engaging the business community and the economists in a way that they had not done previously. The other thing that's happened is that the climate science has advanced to the point where now individual events in many cases can be quantified. It's possible to say this event, which cost this much in damages, was 5 times as likely as it would have been if we had not caused the climate change that we know we have caused so far. Previously, it wasn't possible to relate individual events and catastrophes to climate change and the consequences. Now that's becoming possible. The insurance industry is able to make much better quantitative estimates about how to run their businesses in a way that allow them to make profits. So those two things have brought the horizon forward and are causing a great shift in the degree of engagement of bright people to manage the economic system in a way that handles and addresses climate change.
I'd just like to say a quick thing, maybe two very quick things about that. One, planning horizons are absolutely important, and I am glad that Chris mentioned them. And thanks, Brandon, for the question, and nice to see you here. When I was the kind of national director of biodiversity planning and conservation in Namibia, we had a fisheries advisor who was meant to be a sustainable fisheries advisor. This is a country that has sustainable use of natural resources and biodiversity written into its constitution. So it's a very serious country about these issues. But this New Zealand advisor was telling the Minister of Fisheries to basically harvest all the Patagonian toothfish and other highly endangered species as fast as possible, because if they didn't do it, someone else would, and they could put the profits in the bank and help drive the national economy. And that showed me the fundamental problem of our economy. When I lived in Cape Town, we did climate change preparedness workshops, planning workshops for senior advisors of local and provincial authorities. And that was funded by ICLEI and so on. And it showed me also that even at the policy level, climate change planning requires a very different kind of thinking. You can't get by with the same budget cycles, the same planning horizons, and the same levels of contingency funding. I've put a link in the chat box to one of the companies that my organization is working with that deals with sustainable financing mechanisms, forest resilience bonds and things like this, blue forest conservation, that help meet biodiversity and carbon and financial goals at once. And I think this is what we need to work towards increasingly, is things that don't just deliver profits to a few, financial profits to a few, but deliver multiple policy benefits and, you know, human well-being, water quality, biodiversity, forest carbon goals to the majority.
Great, thank you very much, Phoebe. We've got a question here from Maurice Oscar de Sally de Saab. Esteemed panel, admittedly, climate change is a global problem, but its effects impact people in different parts of the world differently. For most people, it's sub-Saharan Africa, whose lives are synonymous with subsistence farming, with sole dependence on natural rainfall, which is not just erratic, but often fails altogether. Life has become a hard survival issue. What measures exist to address the plight of the rural subsistence African farmer? Mao, I think we'll come to you first for this, if you don't mind, please.
I'm so sorry, Eddie. I just lost the connection there a bit. Can you just reiterate that question? I just got the tail end of it.
I certainly can. So I think the last bit, what measures exist to address the plight of the rural subsistence African farmer?
Thank you. That's a very important question. And I think that we need to view that question in the broader context of a just transition. So we're talking about, we need to transition into a world that is much more low carbon, much more inclusive and so on. But what does that actually mean? Who is going to bear the brunt of that cost? And increasingly we're seeing it is the rural populations, the unemployed, those who don't have the right level of education, who essentially bear the highest cost of the transition. So for the typical African farmer, I would think that's, first of all, the first thing, I think the future of large scale monoculture agriculture, we should basically forget it, We need to move into models that promote high level of productivity with the limited resources that we have. If you look at countries like Uganda with a population growth rate of upwards of 2%, there's basically not enough land to sustain large-scale agriculture. So I see it as an opportunity to prioritize smallholder farmers, because after all, globally, 80% of the food we consume is actually produced by smallholder farmers. So there's a real excellent opportunity to lift millions of Africans out of poverty by making sure that we have the right innovations, we provide the right opportunities, whether it's through the techniques for modern farming that will manage things like post-harvest challenges. That is one of the biggest problems farmers face, access to markets and so on. But I think that the smallholder farmer should become our focus of the transition in terms of achieving the kind of low carbon trajectory that we require.
Ed, I agree with that, and well stated.
Sorry.
Sorry. I agree with you, Mao. And I feel that, the big geopolitical inequity issues here are fundamental. And we need to be really, really careful that as we transform our global economy and transform our society in a way that properly values externalities, including nature and ecosystem services and the atmosphere, that we do so very, very mindfully. And the trouble is, I think that we are sitting here facing a huge indictment, and I hope I don't get up people's noses here, but we're facing a huge indictment of the Western colonial model that has often been adapted throughout parts of Africa, that has fostered, intensive agriculture, and has failed to look at how people have adapted to climate change and resource fluctuations over millennia. And even independent governments like Namibia had this problem. But throughout the world, I think we need to find a way to open up our hearts to a period of deep cultural learning. In the US, for example, there's so much that can be learned from the tribes about planning for 7 generations, about kinship networks that help people finance their short-term household economies in a way that's compatible with climate fluctuations and prevents resource degradation. So we need to be humble here. I do want to say that I'm very concerned that one of the things that stuck in my belly with the scientist warning paper that we published in November last year was the need to halt land transformation as fast as possible. And I think every year that we continue to chew up land and lose carbon to the atmosphere and lose biodiversity from those lands and those soils is a huge extra chain around our necks. And so I would like to see us all, each of us here, starting that conversation with our friends, our families, our policymakers, our colleagues, about how do we use the existing transformed land more effectively, more intensively, and what does it mean for us? I think that it means that we have to think about densifying our urban settlements, certainly our suburban settlements. It means diversifying the way we use land so that we can try to generate renewable energy in the same places that we're living, for example. We are using land so wastefully, and our climate crisis is a direct result of that.
I perhaps will just add one comment here, and I do it with some trepidation. There's huge injustice baked into the situation in which we find ourselves. If we start looking to see where the carbon dioxide that is sitting in the atmosphere that's been pumped up there over the last 100 years came from, it was pumped up very disproportionately, and yet the consequences are also disproportionate, but in a different way. And so there is a huge injustice there, and it at some point needs to be addressed. But the climate crisis is so serious, and the pace and scale of action that is required to address it for everybody's benefit is so pressing, that my feeling is that it's probably, in my humble opinion, better to say, look, we are where we are. None of us would wish to be where there have been many benefits. Let's not ignore the benefits that, again, have been unequally distributed, but there have been benefits. So let's not ignore that. Let's not be too dark about it. But we are where we are. And so we all need to hold an adult conversation to say, you know, how are we going to address this issue and, let's say, get to net zero by 2050, which is hard enough. And if we can bake into that some of the rebalancing of the injustices, that's great. But actually, the first thing is more important. Somehow we've got to get to net zero. And I know that's going to be controversial, but I have a feeling that if we don't take that attitude, we will get blocked. We will go down into rabbit holes and rat holes, arguing about the unfairness of generating resentment that will block the main thrust, which is to address the problem first.
It's a really interesting point, and I've been very involved in a number of groups since I returned to North America a few years ago that really treat injustice and inequity at the core of the design of solutions. And it is possible to do that in a way that doesn't evolve into fruitless bickering and finger pointing, because I agree with you, Chris, we actually don't have the time for fruitless or pointless bickering in any dimension. But if we don't treat inequity at the heart of our climate solutions and our biodiversity solutions, we will only widen them, and widen them on a scale that we have not seen before. I'm really worried about that. And so I've become convinced that it's possible to do them at the same time. And it's actually, you know, despite the US being so far behind in many respects on this issue, there's fantastic energy and diverse opinions happening now.
If it is possible to do that, and I really hope it is, you know, I'd be interested to hear about the examples that you're referring to. Then of course it becomes inspirational, because it becomes ethical. It strengthens integrity, honesty, all of the things that at heart most people like to identify with. So it would add an extra energy to the issue. But I'm just worried, as you say, about getting diverted into cul-de-sacs that prevent us from solving the core problem.
When you've sat at the UN as a negotiator, as I did for some years for the Biodiversity Convention, you see the geopolitical things that just stop activity. You know, the North is the problem and we're the South and we need money, and it doesn't get beyond that. So we need to have a frank discussion that time is running out, Rome is burning, we've got to get from A to B as fast as possible. How do we do it fairly in a way that completely transforms the way we've been thinking about the world? Okay,
well, I go for that.
To probably fuel the discussion a little bit further, but maybe direct it slightly as well, bringing in a couple of questions. And I'd actually like to direct you all as well a little bit to our aim that we've got a year now going towards COP26. Scientists Warning Europe is based at the moment in the UK, of course, that is the host, co-host with Italy. So thinking about, and these type of discussions happen incessantly at the COPs, as we know, about the equity and funding issues. So let's bring in a couple of questions and then go to that. So Pam Rosling asks, how can developing countries resolve the dilemma between their own needs for land and the worldwide demand for land to plant trees in the tropics to offset their overconsumption. And then Jane Cominetti says, regarding financing mechanisms, and given that the climate and ecological emergency is to a large degree caused by richer consumerist societies, and I just add in there what one speaker said before, let's call them the overdeveloped countries. How can pressure be put on overdeveloped countries to fund poorer countries to tackle the crisis at a local level? Let's go, Chris. Would you mind tackling this first, please?
I have to say, I'm uncomfortable because it's really not my area, and as you said, it extends the discussion we've just been having. I mean, I think the events of this week show that the pendulum might be swinging back from what you might call the dominance of the kind of Wolf of Wall Street view, that the way that human society should be organized is, nature red in tooth and claw, and that we simply all fight each other for personal benefit, to one which is a little bit more thoughtful about sharing resources for the benefit of humankind more generally. So hopefully there's, the pendulum may be swinging back in the direction that will help the goal that we're identifying here. How you persuade, I mean, and let's not forget that COVID, we haven't mentioned COVID yet, but COVID is a huge unknown force. I mean, the world economy is kind of on autopilot and running on vapor at present, but there will be a denouement at some point. None of us knows how this is going to play out. So under those circumstances, whether chancellors of the Exchequer, who are desperately trying to manage their own economies for political reasons and social reasons, will be able to take the broader view about the net benefit of humanity is pretty much an unknown on the timescale of COP26. So I'm pointing to a problem, and I don't know quite how one answers it. But what I do know is that as long as it requires the voices of this organization and ourselves as individuals and our links and available levers of influence to keep sending home that message, that it goes back to the natural step. Some of you may remember that 30, 40 years ago, the natural step emerged from Sweden. I thought it was always interesting, the four fundamental laws underlying human relationship with nature were: if you're digging something out of the ground and its accumulation in the environment damages it, then either don't dig it up or manage it very carefully. If you synthesize stuff that does the same thing, then manage that very carefully. Don't take a chainsaw to the biosphere because it provides our ecosystem services upon which we rely. But the fourth one was interesting: seek human equity, because if you don't seek equity, you will not be able to address the first three. So those have to be the underlying principles as a sort of drumbeat that we continue to radiate at the economists and politicians in power.
That's wonderful. Maybe I could open it to Mao first and then Phoebe, and just maybe ask again, any sort of thoughts towards COP26 as well would be very interesting, please. You're muted, Mao. You need to unmute.
So I'm saying, can I pass the baton to Phoebe as I correct my thoughts as well?
Okay,
I'm sorry, I'm typing a response to Kevin Webb, so I can't add anything right now, Ed. Sorry, but maybe if I can add something to a previous discussion. There's been talk in the chat function and verbally about the costs of the perceived costs of climate action, and when I first started working with economists, I really listened to how they basically said, if you think that the costs of action are significant, wow, just wait for the costs of inaction. And they're almost universally order or more of magnitude higher than the costs of action. And we simply have to have those conversations that make it untenable for politicians or faith community leaders or teachers or grumpy uncles to make that argument anymore. It is just not tenable to say that it costs too much. So I would like to just remind people of that. Please help convey that message.
Somebody mentioned Bill Nordhaus and the Nobel Prize and his linear view with much discounted future costs, which show that the optimum temperature for the planet is 4 degrees, which is, absolutely obviously idiotic. But the fact that that view could prevail is something that the world of economics really needs to stamp on with a vengeance.
Totally agree with those comments. It's the way people talk about it. I've just been in a meeting before. If you think about World War II coming and 5 COVIDs at the same time, it's handling that sort of thing at the same time in terms of size, huge. Right, moving on now, trees. So Fola Babalola asks, I hear and read many countries planting trees in millions to mitigate climate change. But my worry is, are there management strategies put in place to care for these trees to maturity? Are these million trees really survived as acclaimed? And if I could just ask you actually some general comments on tree planting, which is talked about incessantly, of course, within circles related to climate change. And a comment I heard in another talk earlier on is that if all of the net zero targets in the world were put together and all the trees that were there to offset the final emissions that weren't prevented, we need 3 planets to plant the trees on.
Thank you, Fola, for that question, and it's so important. And I should say that Professor Fola Babalola is himself a really distinguished and active forester at the University of Ilorin in Nigeria. And so he knows better than all of us, or many of us here certainly, that mature trees are the ones that sequester carbon. So that stewardship of saplings and seedlings and saplings through to maturity is essential. We need to do it, but we need to make sure that it's properly done. But just as importantly, if not much more importantly, we need to make sure that we are not cutting down mature trees anywhere if we can possibly avoid it. It is a huge, tragic loss. And I think I'll leave it at that. But thank you, Fola. Maybe you'd like to, I'm not sure whether you can unmute yourself and elaborate. Is that possible, Ed?
I think so. So let me just see. Would you like to try to, I'm trying to find you on the thing to actually unmute you. Sorry, Will, would you mind finding Fola Babalola on the, and unmute him if you can, please. Oh, there we are, right, okay. Right, please go ahead, Fola. Are you there, Fola?
Oh, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me, please?
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. What I'm trying to say to the panel, I've been following and I really love what you've been saying. My major concern is a lot of countries, a lot of organizations, a lot of people have been claiming that they are planting trees all over the world. And the number of trees were in millions, even the green great belt of Africa and all that. But the major concern that I have is a number of people plant trees without putting in place the management strategy to make sure that these trees actually grow to maturity to mitigate the impact of climate change. So it is not just about mentioning figure, it's not just about telling people that we are planting trees, but it's about putting in place the management strategies to make sure that this tree actually grow to maturity. A number of observations. I'm into tree planting, but from observation, I discovered that if you use $1 to plant a tree, you need maybe between $3 to $4 to make sure that the tree is taken care of to maturity. So we don't just plant, but we make sure we put in place strategy to take care of this tree to maturity. So I'm just telling people who are into tree planting to make sure that we don't just plant to go and sleep. We must make sure that we take care of these trees in order to reach maturity and to be able to fight the climate change that we are all talking about today. So, you know, it's not just about planting trees, but taking care of maturity.
Thank you, Fola. I think that's really important. And also we need to remember that not everywhere should have trees planted. Remember that when you plant trees in unsuitable habitats, it decreases the albedo of the planet and sucks up more heat. So that's a pretty fundamental thing we also need to bear in mind. Mao, did you have anything to say about that, or Chris?
Yeah, no, I think that for me, it speaks to the idea of that there's one solution that fits all. You know, we've seen that from traditional species conservation, where we talk about the big five, you know, want to protect the elephants, want to protect, you know, the lions, the things that are sexy. And I think that the tree planting almost fell into that kind of trap, because we need to provide our ecosystems holistically, whether it's grasslands and whether it's even ensuring that we have good farming practices that do not expose the land to, you know, basically minimum tilling. And so there are a lot of practices that can be promoted that enable us to retain more carbon in the soil. And I think that this idea that trees are the panacea to all the issues we face is quite problematic, because like you said, some ecosystems are actually not. In South Africa, we've seen traditionally where they have planted pine across the landscape, which proved significant problem around water security.
Oh.
We've lost you, Mao. Maybe turn your video off to get better bandwidth. So we've lost you. Maybe turn the video off and then we'll be able to hear you again. Okay. If not, I think we're going to move to you, Chris, while Mao sorts out his bandwidth. So, Chris,
yeah, well,
go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Again, this is obviously an area a little bit outside my normal expertise, but it's interesting. I've become a great fan of the Woodland Trust in the UK and have been dealing with them quite a lot recently. And just stepping back from the issue a little bit before I say a few words about that, the law of unintended consequences plays out in any of these measures that we consider to try and deal with the carbon problem. And so, of course, as Phoebe just said, if you plant the trees in the wrong place, you change the albedo, so you may suck down some carbon, but you may further upset the energy imbalance of the planet. We know that the changing climate is changing the goalposts in where you can safely plant trees and where trees prosper already through changes in pests and disease, the shifting of the climatic boundaries of water, moisture, sunlight, and freeze cycles, and all the rest of it. So you're trying to chase a moving target. And what worries me is that there's been a lot of astroturfing in terms of religious kind of offsets of if you fly, somebody will plant a tree somewhere, and there has been some let's say less than perfect practice in the way that has been secured. So this issue is, as ever, more complex than it might at first seem. But the thing that I think gives me hope is I'm very taken with this rewilding ideas. I think the third law of ecology is nature knows best. And so rather than replanting, allowing forests to develop in a way that is naturally suited to the habitat and environment in which it finds itself, I think offers a very hopeful way forward. Because in the end, you have to convince yourself that you have locked up carbon in a secure way, and one that won't then be released, unfortunately, I don't know, by wildfires or pests or whatever it is, at some date in the future. I think those are the points I would make.
Great, thank you. Mao, would you like to add something onto that now, if we've got you back?
I don't know where you lost me at, but Chris basically emphasized the issue. I wanted to say that, we need to promote, we need to be cognizant of the idea that trees are not a panacea to all our problems. We need to be able to understand where are the opportunities for reforestation, maybe where are the opportunities for even protecting other habitats, whether it's grasslands, whether it's farming practices that do not expose the soil to, to these degradation mechanisms and so on. But yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Now, just before we continue, I'd like to make a little bit of a plug for Scientists Warning Europe while the chat's open and everybody's here. everybody, we would like to be promoting the scientist warnings all over the world. And there's a lot of you here from all parts of the world where there isn't already a scientists warning group taking action. There is one in America and there's one here currently in the UK for Europe. But if you're in Africa or anywhere else in the world and you are interested in helping us set up scientist warning there in order to start getting the science out and to help all the populations and the politicians and everybody else get the science, as we've been talking about, please put your emails or your contacts into the chat, and we will try to get in contact with you in the near future. So please, that's one way of taking action. Let us know. Right, now we've got an interesting question here from Luke Crosby. As you mentioned earlier about population level psychology, at what stage of the climate catastrophe do you expect public opinion, political motivations to merge with the science and begin acting progressively to fund? I think, can we start with Mao on this one? Are you happy with that one, Mao? You're still muted, Mao. I hope we haven't lost you. Yes.
Sorry. Can you re-emphasize that question? Sorry about that.
Certainly can. I think I might paraphrase it for you. I think Luke is saying, as the climate crisis gets worse and worse and worse, at what level do we think it needs to get so that public opinion and political action coalesce and we start funding rapid change, because it isn't happening yet?
Look, I think that if we look at the kind of challenges that have been shown, I mean, if you look at the extreme events, whether it's in the States and around, hurricanes and flooding and so on, I think increasingly, whether it's the public sector, the private sector is starting to understand that there are some unusual circumstances. But where my worry is that the tipping point we're thinking about might be a point of no return. So I think I would argue we've actually exceeded that point where we really need to rally together to bring about the change that is required. Whether there's any specific thresholds, I would argue we've passed the thresholds.
If we had started in 1970 when we had the first Earth Day and the first development of electric cars, then we would not be in this position today. And it has been clear vested interests that have diverted the economy and sown doubt in the minds of many people who've had an interest in being waylaid for the while. I find myself as an inveterate optimist who is relentlessly cheerful. And you have to be relentlessly cheerful when you work on extinction and climate change, believe me. But I do think that although most people say, including my husband, that people will not change until disaster comes and hits them in the face, disaster is coming and hitting a lot of people in the face. And I do think that a lot of the shift that we've seen, even in the US recently, is because of these storms and because of these wildfires. And although we haven't spoken about wildfires, that is another crucial area where my institute is working in the nexus between biodiversity, climate, ecosystem health, and human health. And we absolutely need to get people talking more than ever before just about what these personal experiences, even their personal experiences of media stories, mean to them. Most of my Australian colleagues have been pretty traumatized by the catastrophic wildfires over the last year and a half there. And we need to have people talk and demand action. I'm always saying we've got to have grassroots bottom up and policy top down and sideways paradigm shifts to get things to happen. We need every tool in our toolbox.
Can I just pick up on that? Because, of course, what's fascinating about the Australian situation is that you would have thought that there would have been at least a 15-watt light bulb lighting up in the political community, but it has actually caused that political body to double down on its climate denial because of all of the economic factors about how you support coal and all of the other complications in Australia. And I'd just like to emphasize that there's some research done in the UK on people in the Severn Valley whose houses have suffered multiple flood events, hugely disruptive to their lives. I mean, 6-7 months of getting mud out of the house and sort of rebuilding your life. And interestingly, the level of interest in climate change amongst those individuals who've been subjected to that has gone down because they're too busy saying, I can't be bothered to worry about that. How am I going to survive and rebuild my life? So it's not obvious that the direct experience of a climate change impact is necessarily going to play out either in the political world or in the personal world in that way. Having said that, there has been a big shift over the last couple of years, not least because there is a constant drumbeat in the media now, like a wallpaper. How many days do we go by without there being some reference to a flood, a little bit of video of an extreme flood event or a wildfire or whatever, and the voices of ordinary people saying, my life has been ruined. So it may not necessarily be that they are more motivated, but other people are hearing the story in a way that they didn't 2 years ago. The big point I want to make, though, is that I fear that this whole conversation is very, very framed in a Western Anglophone setting. So we're talking about affairs in a particular way. But look, what was it 3 weeks ago? President Xi of China said that he was committing China to being net zero by 2056, or was it 2060? I think it might have been 2060. This was a massive commitment because whatever you think of Chinese politics, we know from experience that if they set a target in the 5-year plan, they're probably going to exceed it. And so we can believe that this is a very serious commitment of a very huge chunk of the world's economy and the world's population. One of the factors there, interestingly, is that Chinese leadership has much more so than in the Western world been drawn from the communities of geologists, engineers and technologists. So there is an inherent, an incipient, direct understanding of these issues in the Chinese leadership that you don't find replicated in the Western world. And we talked earlier about how important it is to try and change that. But I do think that looking towards Asia and seeing how Asia is dealing with this is a sign of hope. And since the US has, at least for the last 4 years, chosen to withdraw from global power politics in a regrettable way, hopefully things will change now. Nevertheless, the balance of power has moved east, and there are promising signs, at least in terms of humanity finding its appropriate relationship with the environment. Maybe this organization needs to consider how we address that imbalance in our current setup, because I think it would be helpful.
Does anyone here know the work of soil scientist and filmmaker John Dennis Liu, Chinese-American filmmaker? And you may have heard of the large-scale restoration of the Loess Plateau in China. And Chris, I don't know whether you were the one that told me about that Nature paper from last week, maybe, or the week before, showing an enormously undervalued carbon sink in China.
It wasn't me, but I did see the paper. But I'm afraid I only read the headlines.
It was based on pretty technical stuff, carbon flux tower measurements, and detailed modeling that was enough to get it into Nature. But it seemed to show that a lot of China's restoration efforts have paid off. And if anyone here is interested to get involved in those activities at a personal level, even if it's just through a small monthly contribution, the Ecosystem Restoration Camps movement run by Dr. John Dennis Liu is really worth checking out. And I've been supporting them, $10 a month for a couple of years. But they are helping take the needs of restoration and the Chinese experience in this around the world. Mao will probably be able to tell us more, but Rwanda has engaged in that movement quite a bit with him.
Thanks, Phoebe. I switched off my camera just to stabilize the network. Absolutely. You know, what I was going to add to this conversation in terms of being able to achieve scale is the importance of leadership. You know, if you look at, you know, I used to work for WWF, and when we did work in China, our colleagues there would all just show pictures of the meetings they have had with their leaders, you know, while we're here showing wetlands and so on and so on. Because in China, as soon as they convince their local leaders, then it's done, you know, and they're able to achieve scale with that perspective. The same story in Ethiopia. Look at the kind of restoration that has happened in Ethiopia. And I'm afraid Rwanda has also that type of leadership that, you know, we might say it's not democratic, we might tending towards dictatorial tendencies and so on, but that top-down leadership has been really instrumental in being able to achieve the kind of scale that is required by mobilizing communities and so on to be able to do this landscape restoration, you know, at a pace that can be able to bring the change.
Maybe just pick up on that. I agree completely. Charismatic leadership, we look for that. Unfortunately, it can go two ways. If you look for the benevolent dictator, you may regret what you wished for. What I think's been interesting with COVID has been that if you look at the nations of the world that have handled COVID well and the nations of the world that have handled it less well, there seems to be a pretty strong correlation between what you might call right-wing governments and left-wing governments, with the left-wing ones doing rather better, and also governments led by women as opposed to men. So since we're drawing to the end, I mean, maybe these are general issues that we should take into consideration. But I think it is quite striking that those truths seems to be pretty resilient.
A few years ago.
Sorry, go ahead, Phoebe.
Just very briefly, because I know we're ending.
Sorry, Phoebe, just go on then. As we seem to have so many people and so many questions, and we could probably get a couple more in. Are the three speakers happy if we run for an extra 10 minutes?
I actually can only run for an extra 5 at the most. I'm sorry, I have something else.
We'll run for an extra 5. So Phoebe, if you go on, and then let's try and get in maybe 2 more quick questions with quick answers. Go ahead, Phoebe.
An Australian-based program, global now, called Homeward Bound for Women's Leadership in Science, made the case that sustainability in global decision-making could be improved by involving raising the visibility and impact of women at the decision-making tables of the world. Look it up, Homeward Bound projects in Australia. Thank you.
Without any question. So, absolutely. Right, we've got a question here. Forget the company name. It may not be relevant to people, but the question is, Brewdog recently declared themselves as the only carbon negative brewery, achieved through the use of carbon offsetting through carbon credits. I'd like to ask the panel their opinion on carbon offsetting as a reasonable approach to sustainable economic development. Can we make the comments relatively quick, about a minute each? Who would like to start?
Now should go on that.
Okay, you know, I'm very skeptical about this idea of carbon neutrality and so on, because ultimately, when you think about resources, and I'm talking about from a water perspective, because at some point we'll talk about water neutrality, is that when you extract a resource at a specific location in time and space, for you to be able to talk about offsetting it, it doesn't actually make sense, because it does not necessarily mean you're replacing that resource at the exact time and space where it was collected. And so for me, yes, these carbon mechanisms can help to bring actors on the table, but they are not, you know, a panacea to all the challenges that we face. So I'm very skeptical around this concept of carbon neutrality.
Yeah, maybe I could add, it's like religious indulgences. I have an inherent kind of prejudice against this, because I feel it's so easy for this to become a kind of get out of jail free card, which isn't valid. I was just looking for it very quickly. The BBC website has changed just now, but this morning they were carrying an article that showed that one of the major oil companies in Scotland, I think it was, had been flaring fossil gases from a petrochemical plant for the last 3 or 4 days, poisoning the environment that people around there have to breathe, but also managing to burn and emit the equivalent CO2 of thousands of cars running this year. And the company blithely said, "Oh yes, but we're part of the carbon, the European carbon offsetting scheme, and so we've offset this, or we pay a carbon tax." And you go, no, you've just released a whole bunch of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that is not the right thing to do. So I think where there may be some examples where this does provide a useful short-term policy that helps people move from one situation to another, but fundamentally I'm pretty skeptical and negative about it.
Phoebe, would you like to comment?
No,
that's fine. I think based on where we are on time, and it would be nice to hear from each of the speakers again in a very short just summary. This is the nature panel, so please can we focus maybe on some nature solutions, and I'm asking you an impossible question, but thinking of the next year on the way to COP26, or thinking of big action in your own countries or internationally, what's the silver bullet we should be looking for in relation to biodiversity and nature over the next 12 months? Phoebe, if you don't mind starting, but literally a minute each, please.
Halting land transformation, thinking about how we use land more effectively and more efficiently and more diversely by the end of 2022 to have significant shift underway. And I'd love to see us figure out a way to have more or less all transformation halted by the end of 2025. There are big non-trivial equity issues there, but we need to start talking about it and make sure it gets on the agenda of decision makers at every level.
Fantastic, thank you, Phoebe. Mao, your silver bullet.
Yeah, I might be quite biased about this, but for me, I'm looking for opportunities for radical collaboration at the landscape level, because I think that the time for talk shows is over. We need action, and action now, and that's on the ground to be able to move these conversations forward.
Chris?
There is no silver bullet, there's only silver buckshot. But for me, I would draw on one of the unexpected consequences of COVID. That is that at least in parts of society where it's been possible, people have reconnected with nature in a way that is enhanced relative to where we were before COVID. When a colleague in the United States investigated what seemed to be interpreted as apathy on the part of communities that were suffering huge environmental damage because of local businesses or whatever, and it turned out not to be apathy, it turned out to be nostalgia, sadness, loss, because they felt caught in a well of environmental damage over which they had no control. Given the opportunity to help rebuild and restore nature, it lifted their spirits, brought together communities, motivated action in a way that had not been achievable previously. So reconnect people with nature would be one of the pieces of silver buckshot that I would fire.
Fantastic, thank you very, very much. And it's been a remarkable conversation, and it's literally following after 25 other remarkable talks we've had throughout this week. So thank you very much to all three of you.